What is muscle memory? Well, it's where your muscles remember things. Right, yeah. What do you think of when you hear muscle memory? You're probably thinking of a time when you picked up a sport that you used to play as a kid, and somehow you could still do the movements, almost subconsciously. What's happening there? It's actually more of a nervous system thing. It's your brain and your spinal cord that's doing the remembering. Yeah, you heard that right. I said spinal cord. And it's kind of mind-blowing. But we'll get to that in a second. So in this case, your muscles aren't really doing the remembering of these movements. But they do actually remember other things. And they record these memories on more of a cellular and molecular level. And it could really help you in the gym. If you want to learn more about this type of muscle memory, I'm actually working on a video that covers this in detail. And once it's up, it'll be linked right here and at the end of this video. So look for that. But for this video, let's look at the nervous system side of muscle memory, specifically the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. They are the ones that help you remember how to do these movements. This is more accurately called motor memory. Say your friend gets on a bike after 10 years of not ever touching one. Something pretty special happens. Neural networks that haven't been fully used in a decade start to light up again. Their brain and their spinal cord are remembering how to do the movements. I keep saying spinal cord. You're probably like, what? I've never heard of the spinal cord learning and remembering things. Well, neither had I until researching this video, and my mind was blown. Studies are finding that your spinal cord plays a huge role in muscle memory. Now, some of this is still debated, as with any research that challenges our fundamental beliefs. But there are a lot of good papers that are coming out right now that support this idea. Check the link in the description so you can see some of the papers I referenced in this video, so that you can actually read these things. Your spinal cord isn't just a relay station for the signals from your brain to travel through to get to the rest of your body. Instead, this thing you have running along your spine is actually learning and changing to reflect what you spend your time doing. This thing you have back here is paying attention. That's a trippy thought. Okay, consider this. According to one paper, we can find organisms on Earth that can exhibit pretty complex behaviors with just 20,000 neurons in total. You want to guess how many neurons our spinal cord has? Current estimates indicate that it's upwards of 10 million neurons. That's 500 times more neurons. I mean, if something with 20,000 neurons can perform pretty complex behaviors, what can 10 million neurons do? Well, some think that the spine is capable enough to handle tasks that the brain offloads to it. It can receive commands from the brain and, in a way, decide what to do with them. This actually really helps the brain increase its own efficiency, since it no longer has to do all the extra processing because it's offloaded it to the spine. Here's an example. Let's use your imaginary friend who hasn't touched a bike in 10 years. So their brain would provide the overall goal and parameters to get on that bike and start pedaling. But their spinal cord outlines the microstructure of those movements. It figures out the right timing and coordination for those muscles to fire to get them on that bike and to start pedaling. Now, how do scientists know that the spinal cord is processing this information on its own without getting help from the brain? How did they figure this out? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's look at one study, and I promise it won't be too boring. If anything, you'll get some interesting tasks to try. So this one paper looked at how the spinal cord controls finger movements, and they looked at the location in the spine that is directly responsible for moving your fingers. This region is the upper section of your spine, and it includes the regions C7 and C8. Now, C stands for cervical spine. Then they gave participants one easy and one challenging task of tapping their fingers together in a certain sequence. So the easy task is 4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1. It doesn't require too much learning, right? And you're kind of just going along. You don't have to think about it too much. Now, here's the complex task. You should try it. It's challenging. Here's what it looks like. 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1. Oh, crap. 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2. That's already hard, right? Now, You have to do it as fast as you can, and in your non-dominant hand, of course. So 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 3, 2. Wow, that's hard. Yeah, anyways, that's what they had to do in that sequence as fast as possible without having a brain meltdown. Easy. And while the participants were trying to figure out how the hell to do this pattern, they were sitting in an fMRI machine, so the researchers could see what parts of their brain and their spinal column were lighting up while they were learning this pattern. fMRI machines look at blood oxygen levels. So your brain, when it's working really hard, will use up a lot of oxygen. So the fMRI machine will tell you where the oxygen is running off to, and that will tell you what parts of your brain are working hardest during a specific task. Now, here are the regions that lit up. We'll look at the brain regions in a second, since these are equally important, but check out what they found in the spine. The regions that lit up are, in fact, C7 and C8, the exact locations that are responsible for sending nerves out into your hands and fingers. Those are the regions that are responsible for controlling your finger movements. And it's wild because this section of the spine shows a learning-related change in activity only during the complex finger task. You know what this means? It shows that their spine is learning. Not only is your spinal cord actively learning, but according to a number of papers I'll link to below, your spinal cord is actually maintaining these changes well after the initial learning period. It remembers. But we also saw that there were brain regions that lit up. What are they? Well, here they are. The sensorimotor cortex, the putamen, which is part of the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. So what are these brain regions responsible for? Well, let's take a look. Now, our spinal cord isn't nearly as complex as our brains. Remember how our spinal cord has about 10 million neurons? Well, our brains have about 86 billion neurons. Let that sink in. There's a lot happening in the brain, as you can imagine. But to understand muscle memory, we have to know what's going on in the brain. It's actually not as bad as you think. Let me break it down for you. All right, here we go. You could say that our brain has layers. Now, the outer layer of your brain is called the cortex. Cortex in Latin means bark or rind or shell. You get it. It's just the outer layer of your brain. Now, this bark of your brain is especially active when you're first learning a movement. Here's an example. Think back to when you were learning a new movement. It could be a new dance move or throwing a ball or whatever it was for you. Remember how much you had to actively and consciously think about that movement? That's your cortex, the bark of your brain, actively participating in that learning process. It was working hard to help you learn that new movement. Another thing that happens when you're learning a new movement is the movements are pretty uncoordinated and kind of blocky. I think we can all relate to this. It feels super awkward initially. That's our cortex helping us piece these movements together, but it's still not very fluid, right? Well, don't be discouraged because over time, your movements will become more fluid, and we're going to talk about how that works in a second. But first, I wanted to show you a part of the cortex that's actually driving these movements. It's one of the sections in the brain that's lighting up in our finger tapping study. It's a strip of your brain that kind of runs along the top part of your head, almost from ear to ear. It's basically where a headband would sit. Now, a section of this strip is called the sensorimotor cortex. The sensorimotor strip can process sensations. It can detect the sensation of tapping your fingers together. At the same time, it can actually plan those movements. It can tell you to tap your fingers together. So it's doing both at the same time. What's really cool about this is that the signal actually travels to the opposite side of the body. So the left side of my sensorimotor cortex is telling my right hand to tap. All the while, it's sensing that feeling of the fingers tapping. So to get back to our imaginary friend and their bike, when they're first learning how to ride, that initial period, that motor cortex, that sensory motor strip, is going to be lighting up like crazy as they learn. But at the same time, there are deeper brain structures that are also working hard. Now, the basal ganglia are one of these, and this group of structures sit closer to the middle of your brain. They're actually the gatekeepers for motor control, aka movement. They choose which movements to allow and which to inhibit. It basically keeps random competing movements from interfering with your intended voluntary movement. Now, if the basal ganglia were damaged, you would see symptoms like uncontrollable hand tremors, or muscle stiffness, or slowness of movement. Can you guess what disease this is correlated to? It's Parkinson's disease. Yeah, the basal ganglia are super important for movement. One other major region that's lighting up is the cerebellum. It sits at the back of your head and kind of below the rest of your brain. Now, the cerebellum receives movement instructions from other areas of the brain, like the basal ganglia, the sensorimotor cortex, and even the spinal cord. It also plays a key role in maintaining your balance, as well as the timing of your movements. Like when you're dancing to a song, it can help you step to the rhythm of that beat. So these three regions are primarily responsible for coordinating our movements. So it makes sense that these would be the regions that light up in our finger tapping study. Now, there's something really interesting that happens here. As our imaginary friend gets better at riding their bike, they no longer have to think about it as consciously. It becomes more automatic. It frees up their brain to think about other things. Well, what's happening activity-wise in the brain? Well, that sensorimotor cortex that's initially really active when you're first learning, it starts to go quiet. It's not being activated as much. Instead, those deeper brain structures and the spinal cord are taking over. They seem to operate more on a subconscious level, and it allows your brain to be freed up to think of other things. And another big outcome from having activity transition to these deeper brain structures and the spinal cord is that our movements become more fluid and controlled. It's more coordinated now. I think it's probably because these deeper brain structures are very good at providing the nuanced detail of each movement. You can even see this shift in the spinal cord itself. It's kind of wild. Basically, the spinal cord stops listening to the cortex because it's no longer needed as much once you get good at these movements. The researchers say that it's functionally desynchronized from the cortex because, yeah, there's not as much communication occurring between these two regions. And actually, instead, the spinal cord is trying to listen more to the cerebellum, which kind of checks out from what we've talked about. The activity is starting to localize more to these deeper regions. But curiously, the spinal cord is listening to the cerebellum in a negative way. Let's see if I can explain this. The cerebellum can actually inhibit movement, like pausing on the beat of a song. When you pause on the beat of a song, that's partly the cerebellum helping you do that. It's sending inhibitory signals. Now, these signals help tell your body to pause its movement. And the spinal cord, it actually gets better at picking up these inhibitory signals through practice. It's likely helping your spinal cord with that rhythm of tapping your fingers together. So your spinal cord is listening more carefully, you could say, to when that cerebellum sends inhibitory signals. So that's what our friend's brain looks like once they've learned how to ride a bike. It's interesting because once you've learned, it's hard for your brain to forget how to ride. This movement memory or motor memory, it kind of sticks around. It usually lasts much longer than our memory for information. For instance, people with Alzheimer's, they might forget their best friend's name, but they could have perfect memory of how to play a piece on the piano. So when our friend gets on that bike 10 years later, these old pathways are reignited. Now, these pathways might have a little dust on them, so to speak, but once they've been dusted off, our friend is biking just like they used to, and they probably don't have to think about it. So that's motor memory, or muscle memory as we like to call it. It's your brain and your spinal cord that's working the magic. Now, they learned the movements and quickly figured out how to put those on automatic to free up your mind to think about other things. And once these pathways are established, you'll be able to revisit them years later and surprise yourself by how much your body seemingly remembers without your awareness. If you were as surprised as I was that the spinal cord can actually learn and remember things, let me know in the comments. I kind of want to nerd out with you guys because that is wild. If you want to see more videos about your brain and body, subscribe. Everyone who does subscribe is directly supporting me in getting more videos out to you. So thank you to everyone who already has subscribed. Okay, I'll see you in the next one. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I'm getting it. Oh, lost it.